This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. As you can see by the title, today I'm going to talk about using history as a guide. It's something that, I've kind of done quite a lot because I am a bit of a history buff and I like to look back and see how things were done back in, way back when. And I try to learn from that and use it in the way in which I create stories. Now, last week I took a break because it's summer and my kids are off school and I wanted to spend some special family time with them. It has actually been a really busy time of late for me. I've been away on holiday and I've been out and about and setting my videos whilst away to post here in my absence. And I really enjoyed getting in amongst the people and getting into the nitty gritty of natural life. But as always, I took some time out to watch and learn, because again, for a writer, that is where the best writing begins, which is basically the simple study of life through observation. As I've written and spoken about before, another very vastly important source of ideas and inspiration for writing, for me personally, comes from the past and the annals of time in history. In The Bowman of Locksley, which was actually the very, very first book that I ever published, I used a phrase which was, look to the past and learn for the future. And what I want to try and do today is kind of break that down and dismantle it and show it in a way that other writers and readers understand. Because, when you look to history and you learn from it, you can really use that in the way in which you write, but you can also use it in such a manner that it helps people gain wisdom for their life. Now, when I used it at that point, which was in the writing of the very first book of Heirs, the Kingdom, in the storyline, I already knew exactly what it was relating to, because in a sense I was telling my readers that I would learn from history to create the story that I was about to let them read. History in most UK high schools is regarded as an option. It's something that one can choose for a GCSE level exam. But I actually think, to be honest, it should be a compulsory subject where every student is taught the facts of their historical past. I honestly believe that if one understands the past, then one is armed to notice the trends of the current day. And it's through that we can see how the future will be forged. And currently, I've looked backwards to the past, and it really has illuminated, how the modern world today is moving in a very, very specific direction. So let me go back to the past so that I can try to kind of illuminate and inform you all on something that I currently see as very, very important indeed to life and also to writing. There was actually a time when the Roman Empire was actually on the brink of collapsing. Now, at that moment in time, the Senate was crumbling, and the fall of Rome almost came actually a long time before the historical records actually show that it did today, which was due mainly to the followers of a pagan god known as Mithra. The followers of this ancient pagan religion held most of the sway within the Senate, and for some, they feared that some of the followers of Mithra would swamp Rome completely and all of its society that surrounded it. Constantine, who was born and raised in York, in what was back then Britania, he returned to Rome to assume command after the death of his uncle, who was in fact at that time Caesar. Now, Constantine had a real fight on his hands because one of his uncles was indeed a supporter of Mithra, and he was very, very influential, and he had the ears of many. So Constantine really was up against it from the moment he left the UK, and he raised an army and marched towards Rome. Constantine won the battle, and once he took the Senate, he wanted to completely restructure the whole of the Roman Empire. But due to the fact that he'd actually been raised in what is now the UK, he was forced to ask one simple question. And that question was, how do we control everything? Now, at that time, it was a great puzzle. And it resulted in the answer of that if we could rewrite history, we could to a degree predict the future. Because it was believed at that time that he who controls the past also controls the future. Now, to be honest, for its time, it was an absolutely brilliant idea. And it's one that has actually influenced many generations since its inception by Constantine. And it really has changed the landscape of history. And not always really for the good. What Constantine did was to understand that if people were to reach a higher state of consciousness, they would be able to transcend a lot of what he wanted the populace to believe, which was actually one of the biggest issues with the followers of Mithra, because they were spiritual, and they were based heavily in a belief system of being one with themselves and one with the land below their feet. I think in many ways this really is something that we see in modern life today, especially in today's world of modern media and the many social media sites and gaming distractions that we have in our modern tech world. We are bombarded constantly with all these messages which we're supposed to believe are true. But when you actually do the research and you actually start digging deeper into things, you realize that in a way you're kind of being misled. And this is what Constantine did. Constantine's vision was to stop people from thinking for themselves or following any form of natural belief system, because he was wise enough to really understand that it was through dogma that he could to a degree sway the views of all the people of Rome. Now, the pagans were free thinking and lived with a view that the earth was all that they needed to thrive, and to a degree, they were being proved right, because that's how they were living. Constantine had to find a way to destroy that, which he did very successfully when he found a monotheistic religion and he resurrected it. And that was also at that time on the brink of dying completely out. Now, it served his purpose well, because it was a religion of control and a religion that placed boundaries around the freedoms of people's behaviour. And so Constantine had the religion completely rewritten to serve his own purposes, and he demanded then that everybody converted to it. It was an ingenious discovery, because it gave him a weapon of equal power to match that of Mithra. When the Mithra followers were promiscuous, Constantine praised and revered chastity. Where there was consumption of alcohol which drove wild behaviour, Constantine then preached the virtues of stability and abstinence as great values of the respected and honourable. And where the followers of Mithra celebrated with great feasts, he preached moderation and fitness for life through health. He matched the pagan religions with a counter-argument, which gave his newly resurrected religion far more credibility. And if all of that failed, well, he had a backup plan, one that was far more darker than its conception. Those who resisted were persecuted and forced under penance of death to take up the religion or die. Now, it's a pattern that would be copied, a few hundred years later by Islam in its earliest texts, because the religion was structured to the ways of control. Constantine then gained more control and power to reshape the future of Rome, and in doing so, he actually did save Rome from early extinction, and he was able then to completely rebuild it. To destroy the past so it could be completely rewritten, he actually ordered the burning down of the Library of Alexandria, which at that time was a bastion of collective wisdom from the past. And once he achieved that goal, He set in motion the attack of all of the groups within the world that were pagan in their origin, as he took the Roman legions out of Rome and slaughtered all of those who refused to bend to his will and convert to his new-found religion. And he achieved mass destruction of most of all the ancient pagan wisdom from that time. Now, the result of all this created a world that was ruled by Rome, where Emperor Constantine ruled supreme, and history was changed forever, which to a degree is still very much true today, as most documentation from that time that survives today is Roman in its origin, and most of that is still held and controlled by the Church. In the simplest of terms, Constantine began a way which was kind of against all of the ancient ways, against what was seen at that time as a new way, and a new way of rebuilding Rome. Constantine saved the Roman Empire and made himself the controller and the ruler of all things. And to do that, he literally destroyed the knowledge of all of those who came before him. If you just think about it, I mean, it is a staggering feat, which set him up as a supreme ruler, and it then set a trend that would mark history from time onwards. Constantine's tactics, and more certainly the battle strategies of the Roman legion, have been used ever since as a model for control. Hitler actually used it to rebuild Germany to his own ideals. General Montgomery used his battle tactics in the desert with the 8th Army to defeat the Germans, who had far superior tanks. It's been used as the basis for Marxism and socialism, and in the way in which it shapes society, it has appeared in many forms of political doctrines, especially oppressive ones. And whether you see it or not, it is actually being reframed as we speak, and it's being used by the global elites today to format what is known as Agenda 21, which is a means of taking complete control of the 21st century by those who have got all the power and all of the means. And they wish to dismantle the middle classes and create widespread poverty in order to fully control the masses through digital IDs and applications. So, you ask the question, how does this help me as a writer, and what has it got to do with Heirs to the Kingdom? Well, the simple answer is I've used it in the way in which I formatted Mason Knox's quiet overtaking of the country after the Red Death. Mason had learned from the past. I mean, he was, after all, a historian and a professor of university in the modern world, where he began his quest for domination, and he actually proclaimed that he was the direct descendant of a once great king, which was King Arthur. He used his position in the university to rewrite history, handing the power to himself and following in the footsteps of Constantine. The way in which the Roman legions instilled terror on the masses that they faced is exactly the same way in which I created the cutter brigades. And when Mason built his first wall across Devon, he created his captive audience, who had to then blindly obey and follow his lead. With some well-placed propaganda, the people of the region began to see him as their saviour, and all of this was planned and manipulated behind the scenes by Mason Knox in exactly the same way that Constantine manipulated the writings of earlier Christianity. In Heirs to the Kingdom Book 2, when Mason Knox orders all of the southern borders and corners of Britain to be cleansed of woodland people, it is the very, very same tactic that the Romans used in order to force the will of Constantine upon the masses and convert to his new-found religion. And it was used in the same way by Mason, as he used fear to bring the masses into obedience and work for his ambitions. Throughout all of Heirs to the Kingdom, I write many examples of how the common people did not really support Mason, because they were forced through oppression to actually join him. This again shows how the world has been modelled and shaped by Mason through terror and victimization. And the first and most obvious of the passages that I wrote to start pointing this out was actually written in the Bowmen of Locksley, and it featured two characters named Stan and Bob. The grass was long, and they both disappeared into it. Jade literally disappeared as she faded away, crawling forward. The two guards sat watching the open ground in amongst the leafy shrubs at the edge of the clearing. What the hell are we doing here in this dark? 3 bloody days doing nothing but sit and watch birds eat flies. I tell you, Stan, if he's gonna come, it'll not be this way. Suits me, Bob. I've no wish to meet him. Just being on that bloody road and being almost blown up was enough for me. I don't care who the king is as long as I get paid. Stan nodded in the dark. Yeah, mate, we're better off here, nice and safe. The silver dagger touched his chin. So, you'd not want to die for your king? Stan swallowed hard. I don't want to die at all, he squeaked. Bob was very quiet and Stan began to panic. You haven't killed Bob, have you? He was a decent bloke. He only joined because they said they'd kill his kids. Bob is fine and will continue to be so unless he makes the mistake of not doing as he's told. Bob fell out of the trees, bound, gagged, and hit the ground with a muffled thump. Jade fell like a cat, silently beside him. She smiled at Stan. Bad night or what? She peered around through the door. Rowan's voice came from behind Stan. It's Stanley, isn't it? Stan nodded slowly. He did not want to make a fast movement with the silver dagger against his throat. All right, Stanley, tell me this. Is this it? Or are there more of you? Stanley was so frightened that his voice was almost impossible to hear. It's just us. Honestly. Stan and Bob really have got no interest in being in a war. They actually are quite honourable, decent men who are poor and scratch out a meagre living on their own small holdings. As Stan makes clear, Mason's cutters threatened to kill their children if they did not comply, so they were basically forced to join the army and fight against a group that, to be honest, they actually had no quarrel with. Constantine used a very similar tactic in Britain, which resisted a great deal of his early occupation. He actually sent his army into Anglesey, which was at that time the spiritual centre of the Druid culture, and he ordered the slaughter of every man, woman and child, and all of the land was burned to a wasteland. The shock to the Celts was seismic, and as you can possibly imagine, a great many converted to Constantine's Christianity as a means of survival. And because Constantine's God was then seen as being far more powerful. From that moment onwards, what happened was a divide within society, which was another one of Constantine's tactics, which was to divide and conquer, something that we actually see an awful lot of in politics today, which has now become so divisive it's even turned family members against family members and destroyed what were before long-lasting friendships. Classic examples of this in today's world can be seen in Brexit Britain, or even the United States of America, and how the Democrats and the Republicans have now become so divided it has actually destroyed friends and neighbours from associating with each other. There's also a very and subtle message, which is another message in Heirs to the Kingdom, because something else actually happened in this country. People outwardly went along with the flow, just like Bob and Stan, but they kept their true feelings hidden, deep and secret. And as a result, the old ways have survived and resurged, which again, in modern society today, we see with the resurgence of Wicca and Druidism, which are growing at a steady rate and have been since the late mid-1950s. If you look to the heavier Celtic regions of the UK, to areas such as Cornwall, Wales, the Isle of Man, and even as far north as Scotland, many of the customs of a pagan past are still clearly visible and practiced in day-to-day life. One of the best examples of which would be corn dollies. You see these in the tourist shops, you see them hung on doors. These are beautiful weavings out of the first wheat that was cut on Lammas in early August. And you can see them all over the place, displayed in windows and even on the walls inside the houses of the people. Now, a great many of the people are not really fully aware of the symbolism of what they have created, and they're not really that aware that they're keeping a tradition that dates back to the start of agriculture and the old pagan rituals of the past. And to a degree, they're a direct violation of the wishes of Emperor Constantine. When the Romans were pushed out of Great Britain, all of the pagans re-strengthened the hill forts and tried their very best to revive all of their spiritual and ritual beliefs. And there are trace elements of it throughout all of the United Kingdom. If you look to Scotland, you will see at Beltane, you will see bonfires and feasting. At May Day, you'll see ceremonies of green men dancing through the streets. And at Samhain, which is Halloween to most people, there's an awful lot of people who will meet in private and share food and light a fire and say prayers and talk to their past relatives through the thin veil of that time. So when it came to Heirs to the Kingdom, like the many today who still honour certain ancient traditions after the tragic end of humanity from the Red Death, a certain section of the population looked to the past, and just like today, they looked to the spiritual belief and lifestyle of the old ways, and they took on board what is referred to in Heirs to the Kingdom as earth faith. Now, this is based on how I watched the growth of paganism through the 1970s and led into what we refer to today as the New Age. In my writing, I've replicated today's modern cultural life, but I've done it in such a way that to a reader it kind of feels new and yet familiar. I've got Mason, who's hell-bent on power, building walls of segregation out of stone to house his prisons and orphanages to breed a new army, and building weapons from the past out of the scraps of a destroyed society. And then on the other hand, I have the woodland peoples who live more akin to the medieval era, living off the land, using simple tools and simple weapons, such as the longbow and handmade arrows for hunting and defence. They are a free people, released from the chains of the controls of the so-called modern world, living at one with the land and with the ability to think for themselves and explore their own spiritual sides. They're absolutely everything that Constantine tried to rid the world of, and they are, to a degree, a direct violation of his rule. It creates a fascinating dynamic when you realise that both sides have reworked the past, and both believe that their side is right. Just as the Celts of the Dark Ages did when they pushed the Romans back and fought for the land of their ancient ancestors and fathers. World Wars I and II were not unsimilar. Hitler forced his will during World War II on the people of Europe, who caved in to his power and joined him. And strangely enough, none more so than the Ukraine territories, who sheltered and supported Hitler's ideologies. Europe wrote rules to ensure that there would never be a war in Europe again, and they made pacts with the states and countries involved. And yet today there is a war in Europe once again, and the Ukraine people today find themselves caught in a war with another country of great power and strength, in complete and utter violation of those very treaties of peace. It's almost like we have learned nothing. History is repeating itself over and over, and nothing really changes or gets resolved, which is again where Heirs to the Kingdom becomes more relevant, because it's within the series that I write an alternative ending, one that sees the hero of the story finally win over the oppression of his people, and in doing so he learns a very deep hatred of war and the killing and control of innocents. Young Robert of Locksley is well educated by his mother, of which history was an important aspect. From history he's learned the lessons of the past, and he's determined that there will be no more war. Robbie pardons all of the fighters and allows them to return to their homes and restart their lives with their families, which to a degree, creates some controversy, because there are many who want them enslaved, imprisoned, or even murdered. He encourages Father Warren at the church to embrace all religions and creeds, and as a result in Locksley everybody was welcome. It was a really, really clever move, because even though he was deeply rooted personally in the earth faith, his recognition and acceptance of all whom he made welcome ensured that the likes of Mason Knox would never again be able to use a religious sect against him, as he had done with the Church of England, who Mason bribed against Robbie and the woodland people. Robbie hung up his sword and turned to a life of peace, and in doing so he set an example to all. It is a lesson we have still got to learn in modern society today. The arms industry has grown very, very strong, much along the lines of the wishes of Mason, and we do still have wars all over the planet going on today, which barely anybody reports because they've been going on for so long. Nobody really wants to hear about them, and there is a result where rich men get richer and the poorer suffer. The new religion and god of all is greed and money and power through status and shaming, a method which was used by Constantine and is still used to this day as a means of control, and it can be seen throughout all of the Curio Chronicles by Marjorie and her followers. The pattern of the stories are simply a reflection of true life from the past and also from today. For any writer, using history as a guide is a fantastic way to frame out a really good story. In the case of Heirs to the Kingdom, I wrote it in a much more subtle way. The book was a post-apocalyptic tale with a strong sense of nostalgia from a bygone age long since past. But when it came to the Curio Chronicles, I brought the story bang up to date, and I looked at today's world with a very critical eye. And then I looked back to Rome in order to see if there were any patterns that I could use from history that would help me frame this story in a realistic way. And to be honest, I was not disappointed. Comparing yesteryear with today's bright modern culture, it became very clear to me that once again in society there's been this kind of rewriting of past history. If you remember, Constantine remodeled the past to suit his own needs. Well, that's not gone away, but it manifests itself in different ways. Simply look to the rise of modern multinational corporations. They have spanned the world, so much so that they're not controlled by any country. They've become a creed, writing their own way of life unto themselves, and they dominate the landscape, destroying any competitor that stands in their way. They have no rules which have been set by any nation, and they can flout labour laws and exploit those who are forced out of poverty to work in exploitative working conditions. Their public relationships are so finely tuned that just like the Christianity of Constantine's past, they've absolutely have convinced the world population that these people cannot live without them. And so they rule, hiding their sins and preaching their virtues, as they hold the greatest share of the book retailing market and exploit the very creators of their source products, which is stories and books. It pays to really study the past and then apply it to the modern world, because when you do, you will find little has changed from what was once called a barbaric world. Now, for myself as a writer, and learning from the past compared to the modern world, it's been really easy for me to take the character of Marjorie and apply the same thought process of Constantine and place it in a very modern landscape. Marjorie has a very set idea of how the village of Wotton Dursley should be run, based on what she defines as its traditional heritage. So, in her mind, that heritage must be protected at all costs. Now, the problem is here that what Marjorie has done is create a much more idealized version of how the village should be perceived. She is literally hanging on a picture of Wotton Dursley that is frozen in time and does not take into account the changes happening within the modern world. In a sense, she has rewritten history in order to control the future, which she deems will be her legacy forever. It's almost like swimming against the tide as progress moves onward, and she fights hard to prevent it and keep Wotton the old worldly ideal she holds for it. Her view is stamped on others by her forceful manner, and at times, as we see in Abigail's Summer, that is through underhanded means and blackmail that she dominates everything. It is less violent and brutal, but it is no different to Constantine, who bullied and intimidated people to the point where they complied to his wishes and fell in line. Like Constantine, Marjorie has full control through the art of oppression, so it made complete sense to me that the only way to break her hold would, like the past, be to introduce a pagan to fight against her. Enter Birch, the Wiccan naturist, lover of freedom and the earth, and studying all things sexual and clinical psychology, with the goal of joining her mum's practice in Manchester as one of the country's leading sex therapists. I lumped everything that I could find into Birch that was anti-oppression, and I partnered her up with Abigail as her new and best friend forever. I created the perfect nemesis for Marjorie and then put them together in a village to fight it out with a lot of craziness, sexual innuendo and humour, and it really did work beautifully. I wrote the start of this in Abigail's Summer, where Marjorie confronts Abby with her dark hair for the first time as she sits with Birch and her mother. "Oh, how nice. You're having time with your girls, Felicity." The cool, superior voice ripped through me, and I went cold inside. I looked up to see Marjorie eyeing me carefully. "It's so nice to see you finally made it out of your house and back into the population, Abigail. Although, I'm surprised to see you in this establishment. From what I've heard, I would have thought the station pub would be more to your style these days." It was a well-known fact in the village that the poorer end of the population frequented it. My mum rose calmly from her seat. Birch looked up. "Marjorie, isn't it?" We'd been there. We found it was not crass enough for us, so we thought we'd brighten up the atmosphere in town, considering it's a summer event. She looked right down her nose at Birch. "I take it you are the Birch woman." My mum moved forward. "There's no need for this match." I felt so small in that moment, I just wanted to shrivel up and get swallowed into the floor. I felt dead to take my hand, and I could feel the tears well up in my eyes. This was all my fault, and now Mum would have to face the consequences. and just after things were really getting good between us. The tears dripped onto the table as I held my head down. Bert stood up. My mum held her hand back to tell her to hold off, and stared at Madge. We paid to be in here, and we're doing our bit for the community by supporting this establishment and event, as we always have. Madge murmured. You're correct, that in previous years your family has enhanced the reputation of these events, not lowered them as they have today. We have standards in this village, and you used to support them, not help lure them with your transient-looking child and her friends. My God, Felicity, what has happened to you? I once respected you. Taking a good long look at history, and then spotting the patterns of modern society today, which matched up. As a writer, I was able to weave a very modern contemporary narrative throughout the Curio Chronicles that was fresh, it was up to date, and yet it was steeped in historical precedents. I had an oppression, a dictator, a power-crazed leader, and a force that they simply had to destroy in order to maintain the fake front that they had created. Now all of that was pitted against a different creed, which in this case was a younger generation, who saw the injustice in the rule of an oppressor and saw how others like them were suffering. Just like the Celts of the past, they teamed up to fight back in the name of freedom and for their own culture, and they pushed back hard against their oppressors. It matters not really if it was Constantine with Rome against the Celts, or Marjorie with her church council against the Curios. The pattern was exactly the same as it was in the past, be it Rome, Germany in 2 world wars, the hippie generation against the government, or even today's kickback against a woke elite hell-bent on forcing people to walk to their rules. The story is the same, and within that there is wisdom for every reader within their own lives. People have constantly attempted to rewrite the past as a means of controlling the future. We've seen it with all of the places where socialism has ruled supreme and then fallen, which is one lesson that Constantine never really did learn, as he removed all of the history behind him, as he rewrote the rules for his brand new idea of the future. And that, was that eventually that he learned every empire falls. I'm watching the world today as it unfolds and taking aspects as the creative wisdom that I will weave into books. Currently I'm watching how the woke is clashing with the awakened, which are two very different forces that are currently battling things out. And even with that I can see echoes of Constantine and the rewriting and erasing of history to suit those who wish to control everything. I think the one thing that I've really come to understand is that embracing who you are and being able to critically think is an act of survival against the dogma and indoctrination of people like Constantine. History teaches the lessons we all need for life, and it is certainly a very valuable tool for all readers and writers, and for the very fabric of stories onto which creative plots can be embroidered like a tapestry. Being able to understand what has gone before us and to carefully consider the pitfalls of dogma is a vitally important ingredient to a happy and contented life, and it is something I feel every writer should use to inform their readers of the realities of life via a very, very wonderful story. Using history as a guide, we can all gain insight and understanding, and maybe to a degree rewrite our own futures for the better. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in and listened to this episode today. It was kind of nice taking a break, but actually, to be honest, I really enjoyed coming back and writing this particular piece and then recording it for everyone to listen to. As I say every single week, The channel is still pretty new, it's still in its infancy, and if you have enjoyed what you've heard, please like the video and click the subscribe button so that I can build up the numbers and get a much greater viral reach, where I can then invite more and more people to drop by and listen to the kind of things that I write about and the kind of things that I talk about. I'll be back next week with another episode of Writer Life, and I hope you will all be joining me. So until then, until next week, goodbye and thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.